Okay, good evening, Our Exchange. I'm so happy you are with us. I would like to introduce Ben Yosua-Davis, who is the Director of Applied Research at the BTS Center. And Ben kind of spearheaded the research collaborative that Our Exchange was honored to participate in for a little over a year. And I'm going to hand it over to Ben.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. And so just to briefly share a little bit more about myself, my name is Ben Yosua-Davis. I live on Shebig Island, Maine, with my wife and 2 children, and with a third on the way in just a few months, which we're really excited about. And which is, as you've probably heard, it's an unbridged island out in Casco Bay with about 400 year-round residents. So as we begin, I have a prompt for you all I'm going to put into the chat, and I'm going to invite you all to just write your response, whatever comes to the top of your mind. And that is, what does the phrase ecological imagination evoke for you? What does the phrase ecological imagination evoke for you? Write down whatever comes to the top of your head. And as you do that, let me tell you a little bit more about what I do. So I am Director of Applied Research at the BTS Center, which is the successor organization to Bangor Theological Seminary. Our mission is to catalyze spiritual imagination with enduring wisdom for transformative faith leadership, with a special focus on spiritual leadership for a climate-changed world. In applied research, what we do is center the needs, experience, and wisdom of practitioners. In other words, we're not here to do research for the academy. We're not here to do research for the sake of other research professionals. What we're about is people who are doing their work on the ground, acknowledging not only is that work important, but those who are doing the day-to-day work actually know the most about what's going on, and their wisdom deserves to be celebrated and named. So just coming back, Sherry, thank you for weighing in ecological imagination, imagining the possibilities if we were to ground our thinking in the wisdom of interdependence. I love that, and interdependence is going to come up some, as you might imagine, in this next hour and a half. Breathing sunlight and having your breath expand into the universe. That's beautiful, and actually is a wonderful poetic expression, and being co-creator with all other creatures. I think you're going to hear echoes of all of that and what we talk about in the next hour and a half. For us to share a little bit about what ecological imagination means for us, ecological imagination in a climate-changed world isn't primarily about recycling or solar panels or LED light bulbs, but it's about cultivating a way of life that draws upon the wisdom and example of the earth. For us, we don't believe that the climate crisis is primarily a parts per million problem, but rather that it's an urgent manifestation of a societal issue, that it's a perceptual issue. So really, if the way we've been taught to look at and interact with the world is what has brought us to this moment that we're in, then everything we do can be climate work if we approach it in a transformational way, even if climate is not in our organizational name or our mission statement. And I think about Our Exchange in this wonderful way of envisioning what would an alternate economy look like. And that is profoundly climate work in a place where our economic systems have had so much to do with the environmental degradation that we have inflicted on this planet. So what I want to do is share with you just a little bit about what we did with this research collaborative, and I'm going to bring up a PowerPoint to do so. So the question we asked for the research collaborative was this one: how would organizations act differently today if they embodied an ecological imagination? How would organizations act differently today if they embodied an ecological imagination? And this is a question that's not about light bulbs, but about cultural transformation. So what we did is we gathered together a cross-sector co-learning community to explore this for 1 year, from October 2021 to November 2022, with organizations drawn from Northern New England and the Quebec province of Canada. from groups like higher education to immigration to prison reform to the arts to agriculture to this wonderful spunky bunch of people imagining an economy where we exchanged hours rather than dollars. I expect that you probably know of them. And we did so without an hypothesized answer to this question, but simply to see what emerged when we explored it together. So we combined this co-learning community with an intensive qualitative research framework. And for those of you who that just sounded like a bunch of highfalutin words, what this meant is we worked to pay really close attention to what leaders from these organizations were saying about their experience over the course of this year. About 125,000 words of field notes, all told, to develop a really deeply textured description of what happened when people engaged with the idea of ecological imagination in their own contexts and tried to make those dreams a reality. And indeed, some very distinct patterns emerged, ones that I think have a lot to say about what it means to do meaningful work that meets the moment that we're in. So a word about how I present, and this will be especially true since there are 5 of us in the room. I believe in full contact learning, meaning, thank God you are not going to you're not just going to hear me talk for the next 80 minutes, but we'll have chances to be in conversation together. So at the beginning of every section, I'm going to offer a question for your consideration. Afterwards, we'll have a brief minute in silent reflection. I know for those of us who are introverts, it's helpful to have a moment to gather our thoughts. And then we'll have some time for discussion together. Because as I say, it's really important for us that this material touch down, and we're still learning and want to hear from you as a part of that learning process. So the first prompt that I want to offer you for reflection is this. And this is not something that I'm asking you to respond to in the chat right now, but just hold this as a question and see what sparks for you. What are your assumptions about what it means to be a good leader or a real organization? What are your assumptions about what it means to be a good leader or a real organization? So as we began gathering people together, the first question that people would ask themselves whenever they gathered is that question we always ask each other when we pass each other on the street. How are you doing? And as you might imagine, like your first responses are fine and okay, but can you guess what the next set of responses were? What do you think the next most common responses were to that question? How are you doing? So the answers to that are stressed or busy. Have you ever heard those responses in response to that question, how are you doing? So I'd like to share with you a story that Joseph Jackson, who's the executive director of the Maine Prisoner Advocacy Coalition, shared with us that sums up what so many in our co-learning community experienced, and maybe you've experienced this too.
Starting probably after the Christmas break and holidays, I've been pretty much straight out. And even when some places where I'm working and wasn't taking spring break, I wasn't taking spring break. I worked through spring break, and I was starting to feel this huge burnout. It was just I knew that there was coming a time for me where I needed to, I needed some time to rest, right? And then before I could do that, I got, I've been suffering from cluster headaches for about a month now almost, right? And every day I'm suffering from these headaches. And appropriately when I'm in an episode of a headache, whatever's happening, I have to take space, right? It makes me take space. I ain't no choice. I have to say, I can't do this thing, I can't show up. And then a question that I asked myself was, okay, now, is this my rest? Starting.
Is this my rest? The idea, I'm sure, that people are busy or stressed doesn't come as a surprise to any of us in this room, I expect. This seems so obvious that it barely needs naming nowadays, right? But why is that? Why is busy such a universal response to the question, how are you, that in some ways it's largely lost any meaning? What we discovered with the leaders who are part of this co-learning community is that busyness came from a really good place. They were passionately committed to their mission and to their constituents. And this was also framed within the culture that we're all a part of, which suggests that being busy is synonymous with being important. And to imagine not being busy would be to imagine a future where something had gone horribly wrong, like a failed organization or being laid off from a job, or in Joseph's case, the way he got rest was by getting a debilitating medical condition. I'm sure none of this so far is a surprise to you. We talk about stress and burnout in organizational conversations. We talk about self-care. We talk about the trends of quiet quitting. But what we began to wonder is, why is it when leaders identify the greatest challenge facing them when it comes to integrating these insights about ecological imagination into their leadership or into their organization, they always start here with busyness as the single greatest roadblock? And therefore, how does busyness function culturally within organizations? What is it doing? What became clear is that it appears that time pressures are the primary strategy by which organizational cultures maintain the status quo. This is the way that organizations ensure that they don't have to culturally change. Busyness creates cultural stasis because it chokes out conversation. Sustained and authentic collaborations can seldom emerge if forced to operate within carefully prescribed boundaries. Haste short circuits any inquiries that don't lead immediately to direct action. And they also create an environment where every new vision and every new possibility simply just means more work for people who are already overworked. In sum, if it can't tick an item off your to-do list, the question's going to be, is it worth doing? And because cultural transformation is hard and is messy and rarely happens quickly, any of us who have been through change processes understand that this is just reality. It means that ecologically imaginative work never has any space to get done, because it's about the ability to ask questions that are bigger than one's daily demands and that don't have quick answers. It's about the capacity to sit and let those questions emerge at their own pace. The answers to those questions emerge at their own pace. It's about resisting the urge to press fast forward on deep discussions. It's about giving room for people to bring their whole selves to their work, even when it means that they occasionally step out of their prescribed roles. What this meant, and this was one of our first and kind of most obvious findings, is that spaciousness is the most necessary precursor to cultural transformation. Busy organizations will find it almost impossible to successfully go through a process of cultural transformation. In the words of Bayo Akomolefe, the work is urgent, therefore we must slow down. You cannot get to ecological imagination by going faster. In fact, speeding up will almost always mean that you're headed in the wrong direction. This was one of the places where participants found that even small practices that kind of started to provide some of this spaciousness could make a significant difference, ironically, often pretty quickly. Wendy Evans, who is the board chair of Montreal City Mission, which works with immigrants in Montreal, talked about her experience trying to start leading a gratitude practice for the first time as part of their executive committee meeting. And this is what she shared happened.
So our auditor was on at noon, but he had like 15 minutes. And I'm like, do I just like push through? And I actually stopped myself. I was like, I just don't quite feel ready to implement this, but I don't know what to do. So we had him do his thing. And then he got off and we're like dealing with this audit and where we're major deficit and everything. Yeah. And I'm like, do I still let this go and wait till the next meeting? But as soon as he like had to go and run, I'm like, no, we don't have that much time left, but our own executive group, before we move on, I said, look, we need to, like, as our transition here, and I named that, I said, you know, in the idea of scarcity and stuff, we actually are going to name gratitude not just as something to do, but as like, this is a very deep thing that we can do to name an abundance in our lives. And we just went around to share something in our day that brought gratitude. And wow, it just, the shift happened so fast because also of the phrasing of that, where we realized when they were sharing even something light, but then it meant something. And then as we looked at that deficit together and some other big contentious issues, it was a totally different spirit.
So note how this worked. Wendy had this gratitude practice. She held it against time pressures, framed it as an act of resistance. They took just 5 minutes to be human together, and it made an immediate impact on how they approached their work. And this is one of many examples we had from several organizations, many of which their practices made an equally dramatic difference. In fact, many leaders began to reflect that part of what had to change was their conception of time, which was linear and instrumentalist and frequently outright violent. When Paula Klein, who's the executive director of Montreal City Mission, reflected on Wendy's story, like 3 minutes after Wendy shared that clip, they were reflecting on what they had done together. She said, "We think of time in such a linear fashion, but time could be expanded, and I think that's what happened. If we didn't get to A, B, C, and D, then it's a deeper look at A, B, C. Getting through A, B, C, D became less important. There was a shift to a deeper level." This led many organizations to end their time with us asking the question, what can we do less of so that there's space to do the most important things for this moment? So first, we learned that spaciousness is the most necessary precursor for cultural transformation. Ecological imagination requires us to slow down. The second pattern that emerged had to do with the character of the conversations themselves. The co-learning community, as I'm hoping you're experiencing already, was filled with passionate, thoughtful, imaginative leaders who were willing to share vulnerably about their experience. However, there was one particular participant who often posed a great deal of difficulty for everyone else, a participant who made almost every conversation feel like a disagreement. See if you know anyone like this. This person has a very particular type of personality. Anxious, stressed, frequently judgmental, often overbearing, with a very specific understanding of what it means to be a successful leader in a real organization. A real organization is a busy one run as efficiently as a machine, one that is constantly growing, both in funding and programming or constituency, one that expects relentless productivity, and one that is led through a very defined, very hierarchical organizational structure. Anything that deviates from this, whether that be a more spacious pace of work, a more collaborative leadership model, valuing something other than dollars and numbers of programs, or so on, is assumed to be a result of laziness or not caring or just playing at leadership rather than doing the real work in the real world. And this person's expectations, even when they didn't say a word, were a visible constant presence in almost every conversation in a way that other participants felt like they had to define themselves against. We came up with a name for this person who thankfully was not a flesh and blood individual. That would have been very awkward for the facilitators, but was a very real personality in the room nonetheless. The spirit of the nonprofit industrial complex, whose presence often eerily felt more like personality than the mere sum of a set of dynamics. These were the cultural norms that every leader had to push against in order to create room to imagine new ecological possibilities. And while much of that pressure was implicit, a series of oft unspoken norms, it was also relentless. Therefore, when leaders began to imagine what would be a new, more ecological way of being as an organization, they articulated this vision with often anxiety and self-doubt that came in response to the weight of these norms. There were explicit tactics as well. The spirit of the non-industrial complex is also embodied through the expectations of funders and colleagues and supervisors, most of whom explicitly expect for-profit strategies and mechanistic metrics while creating a pace that demands relentless productivity. These demands can occasionally be negotiated, but they simply cannot be dismissed, since many organizations depend on funders, sometimes abjectly, for the resources necessary to continue their work. As one participant remarked, we get caught in a cycle of funding because funders want short-term projects rather than core long-term work, and this pulls us away from that core work that is so desperately needed in our context. And the subtext of that is always, but what can we do? Because if the funders didn't fund us, we wouldn't be able to do any work at all. So if an organization can't tear this whole nonprofit industrial complex down, then what can it do? One question participants began to ask is, are there ways to communicate with this often difficult presence that can actually be productive while giving more space to imagine ecologically? People begin to brainstorm ways. For instance, ecological imagination, they noticed, often intersects with a DEI or decolonizing lens or decolonizing work, which many funders are actually interested in funding right now. They talked about finding quantitative, detailed ways to describe impact in areas like relationship building, which are traditionally ignored as markers of success, and asked, are there places where ecological imagination could enliven traditional metrics, such as through storytelling, which puts a very human face and human impact on all those numbers? So if ecological imagination is able to discover places to grow in the shadow of the nonprofit industrial complex, much like with space, it is through small practices and interventions. So new stories told, new questions asked, all of which allow entirely different voices to enter the room.
Ben, can I ask you, is it possible when you show the slides again to make them appear larger?
Are they appearing very small?
Yeah, they're just a little part of the screen in the middle.
So
Hard to read.
I thought all your squinting at the screen was your rapt attention. I think we can fix that for the next time around. Let me see what I can do.
Thank you.
So what we're going to do is we have a few minutes for reflection, and there are just 6 of us in the room. So I think what we're going to do is just, if you want to, I would actually like to invite us to just go around really briefly, think like 3 sentences. And if you'd be willing to unmute yourself and perhaps introduce yourself, your connection with Our Exchange Portland, or any other kind of consideration or work that you're bringing to the space that you think might be important to have as part of this conversation. So for instance, I'm actually going to invite my colleague, Nicole, who has just joined us, to set an example and introduce herself to the rest of this circle.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Apologies for being late. I actually was just at my 3rd graders music concert, which is like the sort of thing that hasn't happened in many years because of the pandemic. So it was quite delightful to see a room of singing children. So I'm a parent. I also serve on staff at the BTS Center along with Ben. I serve as program director. And with this research collaborative that you're hearing about, I had the role of facilitator for our gatherings. And so I got to know Sarah quite well. And we were really, really pleased to have Our Exchange take part in this. So parent, BTS Center, and I'm a fan of Our Exchange.
Wonderful. Sherry, could I ask you to go next?
Me?
Yes.
Oh, absolutely. So Sherry McAndrew, a recent new board member of Our Exchange, a passion for the time banking concept and collaboration, creative collaboration in any form. My background is in education and technology and leadership. I did my PhD study in complexity leadership theories, which are alternative models of how high levels of engagement and collaboration without hierarchical structures can yield the most innovative, outcomes. So I don't know what else to say. So
That's great.
Delighted to be here.
Great. All right, Clifford.
Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay. My name's Cliff Krolik. I live in a remote area in the town of Parsonsfield, Maine. Background, I wear many hats in a number of organizations, mostly volunteer. I have an educational background as a clinical psychologist, undergraduate mostly, and decided after school that my next educational program was to open up enough space for me to become a fully human being by learning to use my body. So for the last 30 years, I've been using my body from doing stuff like building my own house, planting my own food, starting a nature-based business to support humanity to appreciate nature. And I've been involved, as I said, in a number of organizations working around renewable energy and climate issues, particularly. I have strong beliefs in certain climate issues that are being unaddressed right now.
Thank you, Cliff.
Cliff, are you a board member at Our Exchange or just a member?
No, I'm just a member. I've been toying with being a board member, but I've
Not
got
yet.
to, not yet, right?
Great.
Thanks.
Sarah, I know probably you're familiar to many people in this room, but do you want to just give a brief introduction as well, especially since you were a participant in the co-learning community?
Sure. Sarah Brake, board president of Our Exchange for another like month and a half. I also am very involved in leadership roles with my church's public policy and environmental action team, a co-leader of Citizens Climate Lobby, Portland chapter, and I'm very active in an Episcopal women's organization called the Society of the Companions of the Holy Cross. And I've been thinking, I facilitate a lot of meetings and I do a lot of agendas. And I think one of the valuable insights that came out of this research collaborative was not being so tied to the agenda, being flexible and being able to read when we need to spend more time on something or when we need to, when something else comes up that we need to address, and being much more relaxed. And strangely enough, agendas seem to be working a whole lot better.
Amazing how that works. Abby, I'm wondering if you're around and might be able to introduce yourself briefly.
Yes, I'm Abby Greenfield. This came on my radar through Our Exchange, and I consider myself an environmentalist that takes the form of day-to-day choices, voting with my dollar, dietary choices, and I'm happy to be here. This is very interesting. I may have to leave in a few minutes, but I do hope to see the recording.
Great. Well, we are glad that you are here while you were here.
Thank you.
So thank you, Sarah, for letting me know that the tech on your side was a little odd. Let me see here. I'm gonna share and get us into the next section, and I just want to make sure that you can read what is on the screen. So, how does that look to everyone?
Really good.
You're sharing your whole desk. It is better, but you're sharing your whole desktop.
Oh, I am. Okay. Let me try this.
Yay!
There
Perfect.
we go. Huzzah! All right. So I'm going to invite you to think about this prompt for reflection, and we'll get this into the chat in a second if you need it. In what ways could ecological imagination change the way you see the organization you work or volunteer for? So Our Exchange might be one place you could that you could think about, and we'll open this up for some conversation in just a little bit when I talk about how ecological imagination changed the way people saw their organizations. So, what creates cultural change in organizations? I think there are several models, and at the risk of oversimplifying, let me share with you two that I think are pretty dominant. The first is this: change our thinking, change our organization. So the idea is that if we all just have the same knowledge, if everyone would just read the same book, went to the same presentation, followed the same strategic plan, that we would also act differently. I remember when I was in grad school, I would occasionally read articles or have professors that would be like this, and they'd get up in front of class and they'd say, if everyone just believed this one amazing thing, the world would change. This is this sort of model. New information is therefore, in this model, considered the most reliable method of cultural transformation in ways that are often entirely disconnected from questions of values or practice. Another model we often see is change our programs, change our organizations. So if leaders do not see new knowledge as the starting place, they identify official institutional action as the route for transformation. So this is, we're going to start a new program, we're going to have a new project, we're going to start a new initiative, and that will be the thing that will finally culturally change our identity. So as our group of leaders sat with this idea of ecological imagination in an organizational question, they came up with, almost to a person, a different theory of change, which was this: change what we see, change our organizations. So rather than transformation being the result of right thinking or the right project, it first becomes the result of change perceptions. We cannot change what we cannot see. However, when we see something that was invisible to us previously, change becomes possible. Margaret Wheatley, who is a noted actual organizational leadership expert, writes this. She says, as a living system decides what to notice from the unlimited stimuli in its environment, it shapes the environment into its own little world. It brings forth a world through what it chooses to notice. It doesn't matter what exists beyond the perceptual filters of the organism. By its choices, it determines what's relevant and what's not. Everything else disappears. So let me unpack this a little bit for you. First, we talk about, I've used this word perception. For those of you who perhaps don't know what that means, perception is just what we see or don't see about our world, our organizations, our communities, and ourselves. So this is our worldview. It's our self-understanding, and it's one that is pervasively and often invisibly limited by the cultures in which we were raised. So for instance, anti-racism work and wrestling with whiteness. Whiteness is a form of perception. The same thing is true with decolonizing work and dealing with settler colonialism, or industrial capitalism and its narratives of unlimited growth and progress, or mechanistic thinking that really suggests that we are the only truly living things in the world. Those are all examples of means of perception. So how do we expand our perceptions, which are limited by history and culture? We suggest through the practice of imagination, which is the process by which we expand what we see through envisioning realities that we could not previously dream of. When this imaginative practice is shaped by the metaphor of ecological imagination, this was the sort of perception, the sort of imagination we were trying to get into together as a group. The metaphor itself transforms into a teacher. And when we allow nature to become our teacher, our imaginations naturally become more ecological. So about halfway through the co-learning community, leaders were invited to do something as a team that would authentically embody ecological imagination, go meaningfully beyond the scope of the team that was directly participating in the co-learning community, and be small enough that it could be planned, implemented, and reported on in 3 months. So we're not talking something big. We actually called them small experiments with radical intent. And without any prompting from us, every single participating organization independently chose to work on changing perception. The BTS Center, which had a participant team that participated in this as well, invited staff members to ask the question every week, what felt like success to you this week? And track the responses, framing it explicitly as a way to deconstruct definitions of success. Ashwood Waldorf School invited groups in different grade levels to go to a place on their campus and respond to the prompts, I note, I wonder, and it reminds me of, as a way to, in their words, re-alive and re-soul their perceptions of place. Waterville Creates generated a set of questions to invite the Waterville community into a new self-understanding with prompts such as, who was here before us? Who is here now? What stories need to be told? What stories are missing? Ecological imagination expanded the way leaders saw their organizational work, and these self-understandings shifted immediately, sometimes in ways that had profound implications. And I'd like to track for you 4 ways that those understandings changed. The first is this: organizations are ecologies, not machines. And there was a story that illustrates this in a recording from literally the first hour that we gathered as community.
You know, during the pandemic, we in our organization laid off about 3/4 of our staff. And one of the things Liz said was, this is my interpretation, is that we, we pretend like things like that were really emotional, and that those people that left, like somehow that doesn't make a difference. Like we are, as an organization, a machine rather than made up of humans. So obviously I got a little emotional. So it makes me sad that we lost so many people, and that a lot of organizations did. And we're not a machine. Like we're made up of people. You know, during the pandemic, there
we go. All right. So we are not a machine. We are made up of people. If leaders experience that their humanity as workers is overlooked by default, it is because organizations are seen as dead, not alive. If organizations are machines, and note for a second all the machine language that weaves its way through organizational life. I mean, just off the top of my head, inputs and outputs or products are a couple great examples. Then it is clear that in that machine, the people are the parts. What we found through our research is that even as participants genuinely appreciate the organizations for which they work, they note how the very frame of organization as machine makes it difficult for them to be treated as human, to treat each other as human, or even to treat themselves as human. As participants begin to shift from viewing their organizations as ecologies rather than machines, they first begin to notice their own humanity, which makes sense because humans are ecological beings. We forget this. We are nature. We're part of the animal kingdom. Oftentimes, this shift began with an acknowledgement of the importance of bodies and feelings, that we're not just brains and boxes. And it expanded to note how simple humanizing acts, ones that feel almost trivial in a machine mindset, made a really big difference for themselves and others, even if it was something as simple as a gratitude check-in, like we talked about with Wendy at the beginning of a meeting, or celebrating everyone's birthday. As time passed, leaders began to see their entire organizations as a kind of living entity, as an ecology that deserved nurture. And when asked about what it means to tend to the spirit of their organization, participants started using language like collective soul to describe their work, or to share about how organizations grieve, or to highlight the necessity of reciprocity and relationship. And all of this began to unearth a different way for them to see their work. And this was the next thing. Leaders don't manage a machine, they tend relationships. Ecological imagination changed the way participants understood what it meant to lead. Ecological imagination, after all, is inherently relational. If you think about the field of ecology, you think about an ecosystem, a meadow, a forest. A large part of the work is just understanding how all the parts relate to one another to provide thriving for the whole. So if machine thinking encourages leaders to look at their organization as a series of interlocking parts that need to run smoothly, then ecological imagination invites leaders to look at their organization as a web of relationships that need tending. Cultivating a healthy relational ecology requires the same intention that leaders deploy for programming or strategy or budgets. And sometimes this means that productivity must take a backseat to more human concerns. Sarah, I'm wondering if you want to weigh in right now. Do you have any particular story about this? I know our exchange is so much about an ecology of relationships.
Yeah. One of the things I learned was that every interaction with a member, especially the challenging ones, where somebody's not happy with something, is a gift, but only if I stand back and let the conversation or the situation unfold organically. If I listen and wait and avoid swooping in like God to diagnose and fix the problem. I'll know when it's my turn to enter. It's analogous. Metaphors, I've really learned to appreciate the power of metaphor. The metaphor that I thought of here is the person who wants to help the butterfly emerge from the cocoon, which actually dooms the butterfly to an early death because the wings won't have properly developed. So I've learned that sometimes the best support is just to avoid interfering.
That's really beautiful. And I think about how different that is than a machine mindset where we think of conflict or difficult interactions or ongoing tension. That means something's wrong with the machine, like the engine is not running smoothly, you have to take it into the mechanic. But what we know as we look at nature is a lot of these processes take a long time. Sometimes what appears adversarial is actually part of what supports the health of the whole. And I think your example and that reframing of conflict or difficult interactions as actually part of what can produce thriving in a system is really pretty beautiful. One other particular conversation that ecological imagination unlocked with here was questions of hierarchy. And so a conversation, and it sounds to me, Sherry, like this is one that you've had in some settings, is questions of structures and structures for thriving. And oftentimes they get boiled down to, I think, unfortunately, like, are we going to be hierarchical or are we going to have a flat organization? Now, participants certainly affirmed the pervasive presence of hierarchies that are both artificial and oppressive. And certainly that describes many of our organizations. However, they discovered that ecological imagination invited them to move from a binary, like, is our organization going to be hierarchical or is it going to be flat, to broader, more nuanced possibilities. Flat, unhealthy structures can create their own set of challenges for an organization, just as unhealthy hierarchical structures can. So rather than asking whether hierarchy is good or bad in the abstract, ecological imagination brings the conversation back down into the lived context of each organization by asking the question, what type of hierarchy do we need to support the health of the whole? Participants also noted that all organizational structures became more obviously hierarchical when the humanity within the organization was remembered and valued, irregardless of what the organizational chart looked like. One leader began to dream about how this might take place if you were starting an organization from scratch. And she said, if we designed our organizational structures based on some of the things we've been talking about, like using that ecological framework, you'd probably start with a question like, what would mutually flourishing look like for both of us in this office, instead of saying, this is the structure. I feel like going back to one of those ecological principles of reciprocity and asking, what's going to help you thrive? What's going to keep you sustained and fed? So this was our next kind of finding, is that leaders don't manage a machine, they tend relationships. The next thing we discovered is that ecological imagination measures different things. So in your experience, typically, what do organizations measure? And that's not a rhetorical question. I'd really love to hear your answers. Like when you're filling out a statistical report or someone's telling you about how successful their organization is, what are the things that you typically hear businesses or nonprofits or other institutions mention?
Participants, money,
hours.
Numbers of people served.
Numbers of people served.
How many people take notice of what we're offering?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yep. Oh, for sure. For sure. I think these measurements that you just named, and there are so many more, are really, really important. And this goes back to perception. So if we can't see it, then we assume it doesn't exist. And likewise, if we can't measure it, then we assume it doesn't matter. So you can see where this might be an issue for leaders who want to reimagine their work ecologically, where there is this naturally deep focus on people and relationships. Traditionally, metrics are seen as kind of like a visible, quantifiable form of organizational self-perception. So the place where organizations evaluate how well are they doing at what they say they're about. And the metrics also provide organizations with the grounding from which they tell their story of their work to others. especially to the donors, grant makers, and other constituents who offer them the resources that they need in order to continue their work. So while leaders intuitively understand that traditional metrics miss something crucial about their work, they often struggle to imagine and articulate new ways of evaluating their work and telling their story. So how do you measure relationships or health or long-term change? And how do you measure it in ways that are concrete and specific enough to feel meaningful? One group brainstormed about how they could use conversations and questions about somatic experience, so experience in people's bodies, with program participants to track how well they were fulfilling their mission, building on a question commonly used in therapy: what does it feel like in your body? Another imagined following up with constituents a couple years after they first engaged with their organization to ask questions specifically about relationship building, such as how their services helped people to nurture friendships and how those relationships in turn gave those initial contacts access to resources such as jobs or housing. I will say this conversation only progressed to a certain point because it felt really risky. After all, it's hard to want to experiment when a failed experiment feels like it could have a catastrophic impact on your funding. However, there was hope that maybe funders were feeling similarly constrained by the measurements they were using, and that maybe partnerships could develop to find better ways to measure and tell the story of people's work. So this was the next thing we discovered: ecological imagination that measures different things. The final thing that came up through this shift in perception was the realization that all organizations have roots. Every organization comes from somewhere, a somewhere that is both about history and about place. So we all have ancestors. Likewise, all our organizations have ancestors. And through the process of co-learning, we found leaders becoming increasingly aware that they grew from something. There was a lineage that they were growing from. And this awareness provided resources both for positive transformation and also for careful reflection. And that reflection was often most inspired by their DEI or decolonizing work. However, as I mentioned, organizations actually found their lineage to be rich soil from which ecological imagination could take root. Time and time again, there'd be some point during the co-learning process that someone from a team would all of a sudden kind of sit up straight and go, oh my goodness, we've already done that, or we're already doing that. For instance, every member of the St. Joseph's College team, whether they were practicing Catholics or not, cited their founding by the Sisters of Mercy as one of their greatest resources for this conversation. They collectively named the Sisters of Mercy's core concerns, which include caring for Earth's ecosystem, as one of the college's greatest strengths when it came to stepping into ecological imagination. Before, that was kind of the one alongside their campus and their environment, before they mentioned anything about financial resources or staffing or anything else. And almost every organization had a similar story. Now, just as organizations found roots in their history, they also found them within the very concrete geographies and communities where they were located. Paying attention to the relational dimensions of ecological imagination, like we've been talking about, invited a sense of genuine interdependence with other organizations and with the broader community. Now, stepping into this interdependence frequently meant engaging in messy work with deep intention, rather than always striving for sterile excellence. And here's how Orion Kriegman, who is Boston Food Forest Coalition's executive director, explained the dynamics of this process to me when we were walking together through one of their food forests, and you will hear the sound of cars and birds in the background.
I mean, part of it is just that, it's like not holding tightly, and really like having the patience and the perseverance, but holding loosely and saying, you know, the community is gonna tell me which direction we're gonna push this. The community is gonna decide, and nature's gonna help the community decide, and we're gonna listen. We're just gonna, like, a lot of listening and just sort of holding loosely. I think the other thing is just an attitude of experimentation. Like, as you're saying, like, you do go down dead ends to get somewhere. And you go down, you backtrack, you try another approach, you know, like, and just like, again, that's part of the patience. It's like, yeah, it's not all gonna just flow. And that's important to just accept as, like, that's the nature of this work, that's the nature of the world we're in.
So even beyond the human communities, you heard that line where Ryan said, and nature is going to help us decide. Beyond human communities, ecological imagination invited leaders to put down roots in the more than human world. They noted how simply stepping outdoors naturally led to different conversations, even if the agenda didn't change from what they were going to talk about in a conference room. The outdoors not only led participants into a greater sense of spaciousness, but also into a broader sense of their identity and mission, one that had something to do not just with people, but with the whole circle of living beings. Some considered what would it look like for us to put bird stickers on our windows or bring up the question of light pollution in our offices. Others began to share about what they were learning when they looked at their local ecologies as teachers. Others remarked on the profound sense of relational accountability they felt to non-human communities and their grief at the ways they'd already been harmed. So in the end, rootedness in both place and history meant leading with both greater intention, there's that sense of rootedness, we come from a lineage, and then also greater adaptability as we interact with our environment. Leaders found themselves more amenable both to their wider community and to their history. And this led to a sense of mission that gained both scope and depth over the course of a co-learning community. So now I want to actually turn this back to us as a group. And I'd love to hear from all of you. Is there, what are you reflecting on right now? Where is this striking or landing for you? What questions do you have based on what we've talked about in this first hour? And as I say, I believe in full contact learning, so please don't be shy. And Sarah and Nicole, you can feel free to weigh in or start us off as well.
I'll jump in.
Great, thank you, Cliff.
I'm a member of about a 6-person scientific research group that has its roots in a book about a particular aspect of climate change that is not being given any recognition globally yet, but has the potential to be one of the largest largest climatological issues affecting the planet. So our research group, we've read through dozens of academic papers and studies on the Arctic region. And both the Antarctic and the Arctic and the equator regions on the planet are the most sensitive ecologically, hydrologically, climatologically to any of the places on Earth. They're the most sensitive. At least this is what we get from the many studies, scientific studies we read. So for the last 4 years, we have been sending information and articles that we've compiled with links and everything to different publications to try to get this information out. Most of the time with no success. Because generally it's being held right now by the planet that this particular form of energy is clean energy. And in reality, it is, we've come to, through our studies and all these years, come to realize that it's dirty energy, some of the dirtiest energy yet. So our organization is sort of having a lot of trouble keeping itself together because we're not having too much success getting information out. And it's frustrating because this particular form of energy is not yet being recognized by the right people or large enough populations worldwide to see that it's destroying our climate on the Earth. And so I'll just briefly state what that is. If you do hydroelectric energy in any of those 3 places on the planet, the poles or the equatorial regions, what you're doing is you're making a major change to the planetary homeostasis. And the hydroelectric that's been done in the Arctic for the last 60 years wasn't a slight little hydroelectric project, but it was huge.
Cliff, if you could, this is really interesting, and I'm also going to invite you, if you can, just take about 1 more minute, because I'd love to hear from Sherry as well before I share a little more.
Yeah. I'm fine. Yeah.
Okay, great. No, do you want to finish up that thought?
I'm pretty much done. Basically, the hydroelectric industry has built hydroelectric dams in the Arctic that are 300 to 600 feet tall. You can see them from space, and have flooded thousands of square miles inland over permafrost and forests and tundra. For the last 60 years, they've been doing that. And to top it off, they only make hydroelectricity in the wintertime, forcing the rivers to only flow in the winter and holding back the rivers all summer.
Thank you, Cliff. Jackie, welcome. We'll be having a recording of this as well, as you're coming in kind of midstream through our conversation. It is good to have you with us. Sherry, Sarah, or Nicole, I'm wondering if you have any quick thoughts.
I can share.
Yeah.
Could you reframe for me, if you don't mind? Is there a particular question? You're stimulating a lot of thoughts and ideas in me, so I don't want to roam too far away from what your central question might be.
So the prompt for reflection I'm popping in the chat, but I would love to hear just what are the 1 or 2 things that are really sparking for you right now?
Okay, I'm new to the concept of ecological imagination, but I'm very intrigued. And as I listen and absorb, I can't take it all in at one time, but I guess I am processing the overlap between what I understand ecological imagination to be and the focus that I have had in the past around complexity leadership theory. And it sounds very academic, but I think it's very, I experience it as a very embodied kind of wisdom about leadership that, so I think there's a great overlap between where I come from and what you're introducing to me. So my, complexity leadership theory in broad strokes is kind of the idea that in nature, there is a self-organizational principle that under certain conditions, meaning and innovation emerge naturally out of high levels of interaction between highly diverse entities. And that that the role of a leader is to create those conditions, not to impose answers or innovation, but to create the conditions that allow emergence of these kinds of forms. So the classical example is like the V formation of geese, because that is a highly efficient mode of travel, but it's not an idea that is held by any one bird. Instead, it's a product, it's an outcome of high levels of interaction between these, between a number of geese. So that is sort of the classical example of how meaning and structure and innovation can emerge out of complexity. So that's my background. And it seems to me like there's high levels of overlap between where I come from and what you're talking about. So I'm very excited about what I'm learning. And I can't say I followed everything you've said, but I sure love what you're saying. And it's like, yes, yes, yes. All right, that's my input.
Sherry, that's wonderful. And of course, as I'm sure you know, complexity theory and studying ecological systems, I mean, that there's an incredible amount of overlap. And many times what we discover is we are saying the same thing with different language or different frameworks. And going back to that roots, there's that, aha, of course, I've been doing this. I've been thinking about this. And it's just much of it is bringing what we already know into a new kind of imaginative framework. So I just want to, before we go to our next section, Dina, I want to say welcome. Thanks for joining us. You're going to get us for our last half hour. So this may be a jumping into the middle, but we'll have a recording coming out. I'll also mention that I can feel free to send along my PowerPoint, and we will be having a full copy of the report will be coming out in about 6 weeks. So if you want to read at your own pace and read even more in depth about what we've learned, there will be opportunities for further learning there as well.
Good,
So,
excellent. I just want to say hi. I thought it started at 8. I wrote it down wrong. I'm doing that kind of thing more and more these days. But I've been a member of Our Exchange Portland since the beginning, and my daughter was part of it in the same kind of thing in Ithaca, New York, where I think it started.
Wonderful. Well, Dina, I'm so glad you can. And be with us. And I think we have all slipped the digit from 7 to 8 at some point. I know certainly I have during the last few years. So I'm glad you're here.
Thank you.
So, let me share one last discovery or one last observation that people made that I think has really shaped our work. And the question I'll invite you to consider, if it's helpful to have a question to consider, is if you can't change the world, then what can you do to make a difference? If you can't change the world, then what can you do to make a difference? So, can an organization change the world? This burning question underlies much of what leaders brought with them to the co-learning community, an experience that was framed as an invitation to join a community of, quote, leaders from many fields who yearn for the organizations they serve to become the best possible versions of themselves in response to our planet's deep need. So these are people who really care that their work is genuinely meaningful, and these leaders also struggled hard to hold to this sense of meaning in face of the problems we face as a global community, which often seem overwhelming. When growing up, I remember people frequently telling me two things. The first is, you can grow up to do anything you want. I learned quickly this was a lie, because as much as I wanted to play professional basketball, you cannot teach height or athleticism. And the second thing was, go out and change the world. I don't know if any of you ever heard anything similar. And this last one, go out and change the world, was an expectation that we found people universally carried with them into leadership. The idea is that the logical endpoint of every worthy ambition was to do world-changing work. And so, in the face of all these struggles, and particularly in the face of a climate crisis that has no parallel in human history, the group wrestled constantly with the question, can you change the world? They came to a conclusion that brought them hope, and I think it's really good news for all of us. Can you change the world? The answer is no. Part of the issue is the framing of the question. We think of our problems in terms of power. So if we perceive a problem, like climate change, for instance, then we in the West consider it our moral responsibility to accumulate enough of a certain type of power. So generally that's institutional power or financial power or technological power to fix it. But what happens when we encounter a problem such as the climate crisis, or even less ambitiously, the cultural transformation of an organization that cannot be fixed? The Western worldview is unable to engage or even see unsolvable challenges, especially when organizations reach the limits of their own power. Indeed, I don't know if you've noticed this, but within most Western cultures, it is implicitly or even explicitly prohibited to suggest that a problem perhaps cannot be solved. ecological imagination constantly brought leaders up against the limits of their own moral agency, their ability to do the right thing. Leaders are keenly aware that they are not always capable of doing the right thing because of the hard realities under which they operate. Their work often consists of a series of difficult, frequently frustrating trade-offs where they are inevitably amenable to other cultural forces, such as the nonprofit industrial complex or the perspectives of supervisors, donors, and constituents. This, as it turns out, is especially true for large institutions. From our participants, we have learned that the size of an organization is a strong factor in their ability to affect cultural transformation. And as it turns out, the larger you are, the harder it is to affect cultural transformation. Participants working within larger institutions noted the durability of the patterns they were trying to change. It takes considerable work to push against what are often dominant and domineering dynamics for a long period of time. Especially, it feels a lot like Sisyphus, I think, because those systems can quickly return to their original state even after considerable effort. Part of this, as leaders articulated, is because large institutions generally are in a codependent relationship with the cultural conditions that enabled them to become large in the first place, and therefore are both less likely to see that cultural transformation is necessary, because if you're in the middle of an institution where all the power and resources are, everything can still appear to be fine, and are more institutionally invested as well in keeping the status quo. In this framework, ironically, the common pressure for small, successful organizations to scale up or expand your impact actually becomes a means to induce cultural conformity, because growth can put an organization in a dependent relationship with the very dynamics they are trying to culturally transform, such as donors or grant-making bodies or other sponsoring funders that will give you the resources you need in order to grow, but who will also enforce the norms of the dominant mechanistic culture. So, with the no to this question came first some grief and anxiety. However, almost immediately after this, leaders began to articulate relief and hope. The journey, in the words of one person, was going into despair and coming out through connection and action. Naming these limits allowed participants to set down a burden that was never theirs to carry. And in case no one has ever told you this, you are not responsible for changing the world. And it provided them with new opportunities to look for productive ways to engage with the world as it is. First, leaders noted that if large institutions can be particularly ineffective in cultivating cultural transformation or in transforming themselves, then smaller organizations have a much higher ability to affect meaningful cultural change, both for themselves and for their broader community. Within the co-learning community, I noticed it was always the small organizations that had an easier time making cultural pivots, especially if decision makers were part of the team. For instance, the BTS Center, which, as I mentioned before, center participant team, was able to brainstorm, plan, and implement a month-long programmatic pause in December over the course of just a few months. Other organizations have directly just polled their members about, do you want to shift to a climate focus, or added ecological language to their hiring practices. In short, it's easier to turn a small ship than it is to turn a large one. However, this does not necessarily mean that large institutions are terminally locked in cultural stasis. It doesn't mean they can never change. Leaders did identify one way that large institutions can change culturally, and that is through collapse. In other words, so if large institutions grew in dependence with the cultural conditions that allow them to be large, then cultural transformation will inevitably mean significant institutional deconstruction. Now, if you are a part of or you lead a large institution, this may not sound like good news. But let me remind you, there are in fact many ways to collapse. And in fact, leading organizations into a period of collapse intentionally within an intentional ecological framework allows them to become something new. After all, as several participants noted, death and rebirth, rather than immortality, is the cycle present in nature. We should not be surprised when it is the natural cycle of institutions as well. And while I don't have the time to tell you the story of the organization that I am part of, I will say that the BTS Center, the successor to Bangor, was the direct result of Bangor Seminary saying, We want to close before the last dollar has been spent and the last student has left so that we can plant a seed for something new. And I am here because of their commitment to plant that seed. So can you change the world? The answer is no, but you absolutely can make a difference. Participants transformed the dominant metaphor behind the question, what does it mean to make a difference, from one of power to one of ecology. Within an ecological imagination, even small changes can make a large difference. So rather than changing the world, the goal is to find places where one can exercise agency with steadfast, conscious intention to create, in the words of Margaret Wheatley, islands of sanity. And this is the place, in these little localized environments, which might just be your two colleagues next to you in your department, that leaders came back into touch with a grounded sense of their own agency and power. This sense of power is very different. It's not the power of bigger and faster. Its process is more circular, tending to the same priorities season after season, rather than expecting a quick dramatic change before moving on to the next new project. One leader reflected on this through the metaphor of soil, and he said, it's like building the soil, which takes time. We know in agriculture how important that is, that it can pay benefits over in the future, but sometimes not right away. The health is actually in the soil of a garden. It's going to take time for everyone to break free of those old habits, and in unexpected ways that we wouldn't even think about. So participants left the research collaborative with a sense of hope and agency, and this took many forms. For some, it was the simple conviction that the future is fundamentally unknowable, which means that we always have the power to affect change, even if the current predictions don't inspire optimism. With others, it was the reminder that we're not alone. As I said before, whenever we engage with these questions, we engage with climate work. And that means that there are others who are doing the same work, most of whom we will never meet or even know about. For others, it was the understanding that they were connected to a larger story, of which their smaller story was a meaningful part. As the co-learning community came to a close, participants began to name how these small changes in themselves could make a big difference for their organizations. So Orion, who we heard from earlier, has integrated ritual into his leadership now, and is taking time to let himself be human in the context of his demanding work. Waterville Creates shared, one of the staff members shared how she's bringing humanizing practices into meetings. People now love going to her meetings, and she's trying to think more intentionally about the best role she can play in her organizational ecosystem, harkening back to what Sarah was talking about, even when that means that she's kind of the squeaky wheel, because that's actually what her system needs. Christopher Fuller from St. Joseph's College shared how the co-learning community reshaped the way he goes about his work, from understanding how ecological imagination is a way to connect back to their roots, to understanding now that his job needs to be less about starting new events or programs and more about just connecting people together. In short, the co-learning community, with its small practice of gathering once a month for just 1 year, had an impact in which ecological imagination could name, and that participants could identify as having the potential to make a large difference. It is this emerging emphasis on the power of small that left participants feeling that it was indeed possible to make a difference, even if none of them could change the world. So I'm going to stop there. And for a few minutes, I'd love for us to have conversation together. Maybe it's about this question I asked at the beginning: if you can't change the world, then what can you do to make a difference? Or maybe there's something else that's sparking for you right now. And we have about 8 minutes for conversation. And Nicole and Sarah, you can feel free to weigh in as well, but I'm wondering what's sparking for you now based on what you've heard? Sarah, I'm wondering actually if you could get the ball rolling for us and maybe share a little bit about how this experience changed the way you've approached your work with Our Exchange.
Well, I think many ways, but one of them is that I've become much more flexible, willing to change my mind about things and to be open to emerging opportunities kind of like an amoeba that changes its shape in response to external conditions.
I love that.
And I've learned that much of what we do is iterative and experimental. It might work out well, it might be a bomb. If we fail, that's where we learn. And I've learned to be, I always thought that was kind of a, there are some people that can just do things and succeed, and there are other people just have to learn from their mistakes. And the people that learn from their mistakes, there's something deficient about them. But I've learned to be really unapologetic about that. And a metaphor here is evolution. Evolution produced lots of failures, but it also produced humans.
That's wonderful. And I love that framing. I think one of the things we learn in leadership is that everyone makes mistakes, or even sometimes you do everything right and it just goes sideways for reasons in the environment that you have no control about. And that's just part of the process. That's just part of the way it means to be. That's just what it means to be community. Thank you, Sarah.
I'll share a little bit more. As I mentioned earlier, I guess my point of contact tonight is comparing what I'm learning and hearing from you tonight with new language and new ideas, with ideas that I bring to the conversation. Anyway, I'll just share this, that one of the concepts I bring is that there's a difference between technical challenges and adaptive challenges in leadership. That, technical challenges are those that the solution really is available if you have the right nuts and bolts and tools and et cetera, and there are a million technical challenges in the world. But adaptive challenges are those where we've never seen this combination before. There is no knowledge about what the answer is. It really is like mapping new territory. And that is the zone I love. And that is what is being stimulated in me by this conversation, your presentation tonight, is that the language of ecological imagination is talking about adaptive challenge, where we are, sort of like those old maps of the United States where, like Virginia was very detailed and specific, but then you get down to Florida and it's really vague because it just has not been mapped before. I'm talking about centuries ago, but that's where we are with ecological challenges and everything else. So I just feel excited maybe to learn that there's another body of knowledge and language around these adaptive challenges.
I love that framing, and that is one, in fact, technical and adaptive leadership is one that I have used in other contexts. And I will commend you when the report comes out. There are several sections that I did not share about tonight, including one about what are the perceptions, postures, and practices of leaders that embody an ecological imagination. And they speak, some of those perceptions, postures, and practices speak to exactly what you're talking about, because part of what it means is to, you lead from your identity, and you have to have a high tolerance for chaos, and failure, and innovation, and surprises. And that's actually a core part of the way that leaders have to carry themselves, especially in this moment where, part of what it means to be part of a climate changed world is that all these things, even things we thought were technical, are in fact adaptive now, and we don't know, and there's no good ways to predict. And so we have to carry ourselves in the world in a different way than we did even 20 or 30 years ago.
Right, absolutely. It's like, being comfortable with not knowing as a leader is almost like a prerequisite for entering, engaging in the problem.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's really true. Sometimes we talked about in the research collaborative, we had a couple of presenters come in and talk about the difference between strategic planning versus strategic intent, and how do you plan for the future when the future is so unpredictable? I'm wondering, Cliff or Dina, if there's anything sparking for you in these last couple minutes before I turn it over to Nicole.
I guess I feel like a lot of this information had become available to me years ago, and probably lived my life around that. But you get sidetracked with raising family and life, and you forget some of that stuff. But it's like, the old saying, "Be here now." Leaders are leaderless. There are all those cliches, and they know how to make space. And time is merely a concept that human beings have set up to manage their lives, even though there's no time at all, really.
Thanks, Cliff. That's a really good thought, and you can see some of the realizations about the ways we view time back in that earlier section, and that much of it is a cultural construction, and there are other ways to inhabit time. Any last thoughts?
I would love this, and even though I didn't hear your presentation, I'm familiar with the center, and I'm from the Bangor area originally and moved down here 15 years ago. But my rabbis and a lot of people I know worked and taught at the seminary there. And for me, what's evolved out of, as I see it, the center here is something I'm holding in my own visions of the future. And I think vision is the word that I'd like to use, because I believe that what we envision can be, we can create it. And if not, we are a part of it if we walk into it. And I'm 70, I'm 3/4 of a century old. And I want to live to 100. And when I told my daughter, she wondered why. And I wondered why she wondered. And I want to see my children. I want to see the young people who are going to lead us ahead. I want to see where they're going. I want to help with that vision, if it's possible. I want to back them up. And maybe along the way, I'm going to be able to tell them, well, those are poisonous berries. But those berries may be medicinal by the time they morph to that point. So we have to go with the flow, and holding that, the fact that there is a vision, there is a future, there is something there, and I want to know what it is what's directing me and helping me build bridges.
That is a beautiful, hopeful thought for us to kind of close out on. Thank you so much for that. And Nicole, I wondered if you could just close us out by bringing us greetings from the BTS Center and telling folks in this group a little bit about how they can get connected if they're interested in finding out more about what we do.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for making a few moments at the end rather than the beginning. But I want to make sure to offer lots of thanks to Ben for his leadership with this whole initiative. And now this opportunity to communicate about what we did. And lots of thanks to Sarah and Our Exchange for participating in the research collaborative. Sarah is a wise and increasingly flexible leader. And it was really lovely to have an organization like Our Exchange join in, because you all already are questioning the typical measurements society is using, right? Like there were many ways in which you were kind of ahead of the game in terms of what you were about. And then there were ways, it just led to a lot of good learning. So thanks for being part of an organization that supported Sarah in doing this and allowed us to share back with you. And truly, thanks for you. Did you say at the beginning, Ben, that this was our pilot presentation? You guys were our experimentation on how this goes. So thanks for being there with us.
That's right. Not everyone was there at the beginning, but yes, you were the first group outside of the research collaborative participants and our direct staff members who have heard about this. So thank you for being our guinea pigs tonight and being so gracious in receiving this new knowledge.
And yes, I do just want to bring greetings from our broader staff team and board of trustees. As you've heard through this presentation, the BTS Center is the organizational successor to Bangor Theological Seminary. And as a nonprofit that emerged when that school stopped issuing Master of Divinity degrees, our mission is to catalyze spiritual imagination. We've heard a lot about ecological imagination, but we also care about spiritual imagination with enduring wisdom for transformative faith leadership. And at this point in our work, we are focused on spiritual leadership for a climate changed world. And we have a real commitment to engaging in cross-sector work. So not only working with congregations and people of faith, but also to be working across boundaries and with organizations with many backgrounds. We also have a real commitment to rigorous and reverent curiosity. So that shows up in our research work in terms of the intentionality we put towards it and towards the way in which we think this question asking and learning is quite sacred in terms of what we're doing. So 2 future ways, if you feel so moved to hang out with the BTS Center, I'll pop them in the chat. We have a seasonal worshipful online offering called Lament with Earth. And our next one is on April 20th. We've worked with a group of musicians and liturgists to produce music and worship, to be honest about the way that we are feeling as we face an earth that's in pain. So if you feel so moved, free, come. We'd love to have you. And the other opportunity is in person. And this is an opportunity to wonder and wander at a local farm. This is on April 28th, and all are welcome. It'll be a day of contemplation and a day of meeting some cows, connecting with the earth, forming relationships. So there are 2 ways in which you could hang out with us some more, and it's really lovely to be in relationship with you in this way.
Thank you all again. And thank you for lending your wisdom to this co-learning experience. And thanks as well for coming tonight to hear us share about some of what we've learned. So we will we'll send out a recording when the recording's been processed. My guess it will be probably the end of this week or early next week. So if you've missed anything, you can catch up. Keep an eye out as well for the report, which will be released in its full entirety in April. And we look forward to being in continued.